Dear students, I welcome you all to this lecture on John Stuart Mill's The Subjection of Woman. The main objectives of this lecture are to explicate John Stuart Mill's ideas of equality of women and freedom, to understand the uniqueness of the essay The Subjection of Woman, to delineate the major arguments of J.S. Mill on freedom and equality of women, to critically evaluate Mill's subjection of woman as a precursor to liberal feminism. Let's get started. John Stuart Mill is usually known for his works on liberty, utilitarianism, and representative government. One of his classic essays, The Subjection of Woman, could not find an attentive treatment until the middle of the 20th century, when feminist scholarship critically used Mill's interventions to make the case for gender justice. There are very few essays that have come down to us from 18th and 19th centuries which deal with women, gender, family, and justice. These include, notably, Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of Rights of Women, written in 1792, John Stuart Mill's The Subjection of Woman, written in 1869, and Frederick Engel's The Origin of Family, Private Property, and the State, written in 1884. Of all, Mill's essay is regarded as the most influential statement of rights of women. On the basis of powerful defense of gender justice, Mill is designated as an undisputed liberal feminist. Brief context of the subjection of woman. As part of the established practice in political philosophy, we attempt to locate Mill's essay in its context briefly. This will help us understand the arguments in their historical, intellectual, and ideological contexts. First of all, the personal life of John Stuart Mill made him sensitive to the issues of injustice faced by women. Mill fell in love with a philosopher and also women's rights activist Charles Harriet Taylor at the age of 25. Harriet Taylor was married and a mother of 3 children. She was a free-thinking philosopher, and Mill's turn to feminism was accomplished her assistance. She liberated Mill of his father's, namely James Mill, who was an economist and a utilitarian thinker, strict influence, and through her only Mill could identify with his mother or women in general. Mill and Taylor maintained loving relationship for near about 20 years and finally married in 1851 after the death of Harriet Taylor's husband. James Mill neither approved their relationship nor did he agree with their marriage. Mill's association with Harriet Taylor and collaboration with her activism is thus an influential factor to the arguments of the subjection of women. Secondly, the women's rights movement had begun in 1840s in United States and England. The women activists traveled from United States to London and held many meetings for spreading the awareness about the liberation of women. This led to drafting of manifestos and announcing conventions. The American women began to demand rights on the analogy of American Declaration of Independence, and the philosophy of liberalism became a vehicle to articulate such demands. The anti-slavery conventions also played an important role in mobilizing the women's movements. While the women's movement remained peaceful in the United States, the same could not happen in London. In 1860s, the women's rights activists clashed with police, burned churches, railway stations, and other public buildings, and when arrested, conducted highly publicized hunger strikes in Gaol, demanding to be treated as political prisoners. John Stuart Mill did share this radical cause. It was in this period Mill wrote The Subjection of Woman in 1861, but published it 8 years later in 1869. Thirdly, in his capacity as member of English Parliament, Mill submitted a petition favoring voting rights to women in 1865 to the House of Commons. The association of John Stuart Mill with women activists during 1850s and his earlier writings defending the women's suffrage made his election to House of Commons possible. In fact, 1,500 women activists signed the petition he submitted to the Parliament. His move was defeated, but he grew convinced of women's rights and equality. The support of women's activists in securing his entry to the Parliament made him all the more confident of the capacities of women as political agents. Fourthly, Mill was also a liberal utilitarian. There is a consistency between his essay on liberty and the subjection of woman. In fact, Mill was writing both the essays simultaneously. Being a committed liberal and concerned with measuring welfare by overall happiness, Mill could not reconcile with subjugation of women and neglecting them of equal economic, social and political rights. By marrying, women would lose legal rights such as property rights. Women did not enjoy any political or economic rights either. The ideological commitment of Mill to individual liberty does not differentiate between men and women, for the overall utility would be badly affected if half of the human race is kept out of fold of equality and freedom. Let's talk about the major arguments of the essay, 5 theses. At the very outset of the essay, Mill sets out a revolutionary purpose of it. He says the principle which regulates the existing social relations between the two sexes is wrong in itself, and now one of the chief hindrances to women improvement, and it ought to be replaced by a principle of perfect equality, admitting no power or privilege on the one side nor disability on the other. The essay established it very fairly that women should be treated as equal and free beings who ought to be taken as autonomous citizens capable of exercising liberties that are available to men. Like men, women are to have access to education and well-being and can enter domains of economy and public offices, that is government. Argument first. The 19th century Romanticism believed in and propagated for feminine nature. The legal subordination of women to men was justified in name of so-called natural inferiority of women. There was a thought that men and women are two distinct natures, one the active and the other passive. Naturally, men were said to be active and women were relegated to being passive. One meant for the strength and other for beauty. One can see the climax of his philosophy in Rousseau's Emily. Consider this statement of Rousseau: woman has more wit, man has more genius. Woman observes and man reasons. Mill persuasively argued that there is no such thing called woman nature. Rather, it is an artificial construction. In today's feminist theories, it echoes in the accounts of gender. Refuting feminine nature, Mill wrote, "What is now called the nature of woman is an artificial thing, the result of a forced repression in some directions, unnatural stimulation in others. It may be asserted without scruple that no other class of dependents have had their character so entirely distorted from its natural proportions by their relationship with their masters as in the case of women. A hothouse and stove cultivation has always been carried on of some capabilities of their nature for the benefit and pleasure of their masters." The argument second. Mill uses history to support his argument. Though he is not a historicist, he locates the subordination of women in the primitive cultures and its continued practice in feudalism. The power structures legitimized the subordination of women. Mill argues laws and systems of polity always begin by recognizing the relations they find already existing between individuals. They convert what was a mere physical fact into a legal right. Those who had already been compelled to obedience became in this manner legally bound to it. The effect of continuous subordination was such that women too began to socialize themselves as subordinates. The process of womanhood is an implicit social process that makes a woman subordinate agent. In feminism, such a process is defined as gender. All women are brought up from the very earliest years in the belief that their ideal of character is the very opposite to that of men, not self-will and government by self-control, but submission and yielding to the control of others. All the moralities tell them that it is the duty of women, and all the current sentimentalities that it is their nature to live for others, to make complete abnegation of themselves, and to have no life but in their affections. Argument third. Mill argued that there had been many inhuman practices which prevailed for many centuries. These injustices finally ended. The modern age wrote their obituary. For example, the slavery was justified by philosophers like Aristotle as a natural phenomenon, for he argued that inequality is ordained by the nature, and slaves occupy a middle position between humans and animals. The institution that was projected as natural had been given a legal sanction. The modern age that cherishes human freedom and dignity rejected slavery unconditionally. Mill laments that despite such a commitment towards freedom and equality, the modern world has maintained a paradox. Mill argued that the subordination of women is the primitive state of slavery lasting on through successive mitigations and modifications occasioned by the same causes which have softened the general manners and brought all human relations more under the control of justice and the influence of humanity. It has not lost the taint of its brutal origin. No presumption in its favor, therefore, can be drawn from the fact of its existence. Argument 4. With the demise of feudalism, the age-old inequalities were legally dismantled. The expressions of individual freedom, choices, and equality became the modern values. The modern democratic life was thought to be a charter of universal freedoms. The chief feature of the modern world that distinguishes it from the earlier formulations, according to Mill, is that human beings are not fixed to social positions by order of their birth, chained down by an inexorable bond to the place they are born to, but are free to employ their faculties to achieve the lot which may appear to them most desirable. Mill argued that no slave or a serf could set himself free on his own or of a desire of the master. The modern legal regulations abolished the slavery. In case of women, the subordination continued, and there was no intervention being made by the governments to end the subjection of women. To Mill, women's subordination is the only form of primitive slavery that continued even in the modern world. He writes, the social subordination of women thus stands out as an isolated fact of modern social institutions, a solitary breach of what has become their fundamental law, a single relic of an old world of thought and practice exploded in everything else, but retained in the one thing of most universal interest. Argument 5. Mill was against patriarchy. One principal reason of pervasive gender injustice, even in the age where freedom of individual choice is now known to be the only thing which the legal and constitutional practices and procedures adapted to, is the patriarchy. One of the major socializing processes that bring women to subordination is the implicit training of their obedience. While the masters of the slaves used fear, the masters of women used love and education. He says men do not want solely the obedience of women, they want their sentiments. All men except the most brutish desire to have in the women most nearly connected with them, not a forced slave but a willing one, not a slave merely but a favorite. They have therefore put everything in practice to enslave their minds. The masters of all other slaves rely for maintaining obedience on fear, either fear of themselves or religious fears. The masters of women wanted more than simple obedience, and they turned the whole force of education to effect their purpose. This cannot happen in schools only. Instead, the family is the house of despotism. One of most forceful arguments of John Stuart Mill that influenced feminist theories immensely is that the just constitution of the family. It is not hard to guess that Mill rightly believed that the family with whom as subordinates is the product of patriarchy, and in turn it reproduces patriarchy. Family sustains patriarchy, and he argued that the very constitution of the family must change. It must become the moral training ground of women's freedom and equality. His statements that gained popularity not in his age but in the middle of 20th century. Feminist literature make it clear the family justly constituted would be the real school of virtues of freedom. It is sure to be sufficient one of everything else. It will always be a school of obedience for the children, of command for the parents. What is needed is that it should be a school of sympathy, inequality, of living together in love without power on one side and obedience on the other. Now let's talk about the utility of women's rights. Being a utilitarian and a committed liberal, Mill argued that the freedom and equality of women is beneficial to the society. Firstly, anyone who genuinely loves freedom cannot deprive his nearest and dearest ones of the fruits of freedom. Gender justice will transform the family from being the house of despotism to schools of real freedoms. The exercise of liberty ought to be consistent with males and females, and thus the foundation of family would be laid down not on paradoxical hierarchy rather than human freedom. Secondly, the mental faculties of humankind would double. Mill believed that women, who constitute half of the population, can equally contribute to the decision making of the family and polity. By subjugating them, human societies are deprived of the half of its mental faculties. Additionally, the competition between men and women for life accomplishments, for example, possessions like teaching, medicine, engineering, law, etc., would enhance the capacities of both men and women. This would benefit the humankind at large. Thirdly, the half of the humankind is living under subjugation, and their resistance to patriarchy would end with their liberation. The various means and methods that women employ which do not go well with established norms would go away. Fourthly, by nurturing women in the environment of freedom and equality, the creative outcome will benefit the men as well. Since there is no quintessential nature, the habit of treating them inhumanly will also end. Finally, the purpose of human life is to live a happy life. Granting half of the human population a just life would result in great increase in the overall happiness of the society. This matches the basic tenet of utilitarianism, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Mill eloquently says, "Thus far, the benefits which it has appeared that the world would gain by ceasing to make sex a disqualification for privileges and a badge of subjection are social rather than individual, consisting in an increase of the general fund of thinking and acting power and an improvement in the general conditions of the association of men with women. But it would be a grievous understatement of the case to omit the most direct benefit of all, the unspeakable gain in the private happiness to the liberated half of the species, the difference to them between a life of subjection to the will of others and a life of rational freedom." Now let's talk about the significance of subjection of women in feminist literature. In this section, we discuss a particular contemporary liberal feminist, Susan Moller Okin, to illustrate the significance of Mill's essay in feminist literature. Mill influenced feminism in more than one way. The issues that Mill had raised, like of feminine nature, patriarchy, patrilineal law, social, political and economic rights, became recurring discussions of feminist thought throughout the 20th century. In particular, Mill emerged as a torchbearer of liberal feminism. Feminism was not a sideline for Mill, who himself was a liberal feminist. Mill's strong belief that women's potential must be developed to the highest possible stage if the greatest possible moral and intellectual advancement of human race is to be realized, provides a chance to assess the extent to which political values such as liberty, equality, individualism, justice and democracy can be implemented. Ocken's interest for Mill stems from the latter's concept that the emancipation of women to a level of equality with men is not limited to attaining a specific level of general happiness, but is a very important prerequisite for the improvement of mankind. Mill postulates thus a baseline for bringing out the radicalism of Ocken's liberal feminism. A contemporary feminist, Rosenblum, argues that some of the major statements of Mill that women are victims of the vilest male factor, absolute monsters, and subjection of woman being one monstrous contradiction, became a source of huge encouragement of Ocken's own feminist thought. The liberal feminists expressed their discomfort with some notions of Mill's thesis. Mill is a champion of individual liberties of men and women alike. But when it comes to issues of married women and families, Mill does not maintain the same level of commitment. He pays little attention to the vulnerability of married women or the systematic injustices that exist within families. Despite his support for the just composition of family as a school of virtues of freedom, Mill neglected a critical examination of families' fundamental construction and enduring structural flaws. Criticizing him, Ocken claims that his feminist writings are concerned mainly with middle and upper class women and the bourgeois family in his model while attempting to emancipate women. Mill's feminism falls short of promoting the equality and liberty of married women because of his belief that family is a structure that is necessary for mankind. The extent to which Mill's feminism falls short of promoting the freedom and equality of married women is a direct result of his belief that women tend to choose the family and its gender division of labor as a lifestyle choice. Ocken interprets Mill's statement, like a man when he chooses a profession, so when a woman marries, it may in general be understood that she makes choice of the management of a household and bringing up a family as the first call upon her exertions during as many years of her life as may be required for the purpose, and that she renounces not all other objects and occupations, but all which are not consistent with the requirements of this. Although Mill acknowledges that married women's outdoor activities would be impeded by their family's jobs, but they would still uphold her individual suitabilities when appropriately applied within the family, which can allow them to completely carry out the typical duties of family mistress. Ocken claims that the reason for Mill's failure is that he defends the division of labor between men and women in the family as the choice of women, backed by custom, and claims that this gender division inside the family is the most appropriate. Now let's conclude our lecture. All in all, John Stuart Mill, the British Socrates, set a current in motion that received a perennial attention and philosophical impetus of the philosophers throughout the past century. Liberal constitutionalism neither contradicted nor failed this political value. The consequent institutional impartiality is a remarkable achievement. Indeed, the case was not easy, as Mill also knew that difficulty does not lie in the arguments being far from reason, but there is a mass of feeling to be contended against. It was not to remain unchanged, as Mill believed. Over the centuries, liberal democracies have evolved as non-discriminatory political systems that adopt anti-discrimination laws and institutions, providing women equal access to jobs and hold public offices. Admittedly, the liberal democracies have unfailingly built institutions which treat people alike and thus do not discriminate against or suppress women. John Stuart Mill eloquently raised a fundamental principle for liberal democracies. The a priori presumption is in the favor of freedom and impartiality. With this, we conclude today's lecture. Hope you benefited from listening to it. Thank you.